Hello, everybody. Uh, welcome back to the channel. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today, we're continuing our series on the philosophy for the everyday, and we're picking up the thread on our reading of Pierre Hadot's What is Ancient Philosophy? And we are going to be I'm going to be going through a chapter that's very short, very concise, but quite crucial to the argument that the book is making. And that chapter is called Philosophy Before Philosophy. And of course, Hadot's implicit reference there is to the idea of philosophy as a way of life before it came to be systematized and regulated in a particular way that somehow wrenched away that active, dynamic practice of thinking and somehow straitjacketed it into some sort of system. So that's his implicit reference when he talks about philosophy before philosophy. But he also explains that phrase in three different ways in this short chapter. In a historical way, in a way that relates, and that's the first one, in a way that relates to the idea that philosophy was a rational way of explaining, of accounting for the origins of the world. So that's the idea of before, right? How did we arrive here? What came before? And the third way is also, again, the idea that philosophy, that notion of thinking for oneself, that idea of living a virtuous life needed something that came before it, right? Formation or an education that prepared you for life, that taught you how to think for yourself. So those are the three occurrences, three ideas of philosophy before philosophy that Pierre Hadot goes through here. Welcome, Stefan, to the channel. Welcome, Rollie Mania. It's lovely to see both of you. I'll go through the chapter and then we can have perhaps a larger discussion on philosophy and on also other things that concern our life. So he starts with a simple historical point, first and foremost. The idea that there was a practice of philosophy before the word was even coined, right? Before there was a word or notion for philosophy, there were philosophers. He says, the words belonging to the Philosophia family did not in fact appear until the 5th century BC, and the term Philosophia itself was not defined until the 4th century BC by Plato. And he's here referring, of course, to a whole grouping of thinkers that are known sometimes in academic philosophy as the Pre-Socratics or as Pre-Socratic philosophers. We're talking about Thales, we're talking about Anaximander, and others. So the idea, the first way in which Hadot defines philosophy before philosophy is this practice of philosophy that came before the invention of the world, before the invention of the word, and before a practice emerged that called itself philosophy. The second way is the idea of philosophy as a rational explanation of the world, right? And that differs, of course, in an important way from the cosmogonies that preceded the practice of philosophy, which means in a very important way that they were coming up with mythical accounts, mythical explanations of the origin of the world. Instead of those mythical stories of the Genesis in the biblical sense, philosophy tried to come up with rational explanations of those beginnings, right? To explain the origins of the world, of mankind, of the city. And philosophy sought to make those theories rational. Philosophy aimed at coming up with rational explanations to account for the world by positing not a battle, Hadot writes, among personified elements, but a battle among physical realities. Right? So this radical transformation is summed up in the Greek word physis, which originally meant the beginning, development, the result of the process by which a thing constitutes itself. So we have in philosophy this notion of before, what came before, how things originated, how the world originated, how the human beings originated, and how they came to constitute the communities in which they live. That's the second meaning of before. And the third meaning of before is captured by the Greek word paideia, right? This sort of prepedeutic or preparatory formation or education that precedes the practice of philosophy, that prepares one for a virtuous life, that enables one to think for oneself. Right? So there was a current in pre-Socratic thought that the practices, that there were practices and theories, right, that relate to a fundamental demand of Greek mentality, of the Greek mentality, the desire to form and to educate. So that's the other notion of philosophy before philosophy, that one needs a certain kind of formation and education before one can philosophize, before one can think for oneself. So that's the core of that very concise but very important chapter. Again, to recapitulate, the very title of the chapter, the very heading, of course, refers to the idea that there is a practice of philosophy that precedes its systematization, its regulation. There is a philosophy as a way of life before philosophy as a system. That there was a practice of philosophy, namely in the thought of pre-Socratic philosophers, before the word was coined in the 4th century BC by Plato as philosophia. Second, again within the chapter, that philosophy tried to account for beginnings, for origins, for the story of before. It tried to give a rational explanation of the origins of the world, of the origins of humankind, and of the origins of the city. And the final notion is that philosophy presumed kind of education and formation that came before it, and that allowed one to philosophize, that enabled one to think for oneself. So unless there are any questions regarding this or regarding anything else, watch related, life related, or otherwise, I'll be happy to answer. Otherwise, I'm just gonna take the next 5 minutes to just close. But it's nice to see you, Stefan. Nice to see you, Rollie Mania and Systems Absurdum. Thanks for coming by. These are usually very short episodes, snippets, 15 minutes to half an hour. So if you have missed the beginning, feel free to rewind and take a look. We talked about an early chapter in What is Ancient Philosophy by Pierre Hadot, Philosophy Before Philosophy, which is quite important for an understanding of philosophy as a way of life, rather than a system, a practice which mostly involves writing books, right? How did the ancients think of philosophy as a practice, as a way of exercising their mind, as a way of dealing with the biggest challenges and obstacles of life? Big Meat says, Bible's out, boys. The Lord is here to give us knowledge. Unfortunately, I cannot do that. I guess the Lord can open certain doors, those doors of knowledge, but I'm just LHV, so my abilities are much, much more limited. Rollie Mania says, I'm still looking for the 5513. It's a great watch. It's a great watch. One of the longest production runs, of course, in Rolex history. Pardon me. And you have those sorts of 4-digit references, right? 1675 is like that too. And there's something for everyone within that production run. Some great deals still in the 80s versions as well. But again, we've talked about this a little bit. I think unless you are going for something with a matte dial, right, something before the 80s, where a lot of modern elements were introduced, in terms of the glossy dials and the white gold surrounds around the lume plots and everything. I think in that case, I would probably just go for the 14060, which is the no-date Submariner reference that takes its place, more or less. Still great deals to be had there. But if you're going to go for something that they call feet first, or even earlier, meters first, with a matte dial, I think that is a very interesting reference, and I find 5513 to be really definitive for the Submariner look, which is itself, of course, iconic for the Rolex Sports or Rolex Professional look. System says, the Pre-Socratics. Yes, it was partly about Pre-Socratics today. Pre-Socratics, Stoics, but also Plato's own practice and Aristotle's practice even in their academies, right, which was really a community in and of itself, right? Not just certainly not a faculty, certainly not an academy that aimed at writing and publishing books. Stefan says, you have encouraged me to buy Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Looking forward to reading it now it's arrived. Oh, that's great, Stefan. After we work our way through Hadot, we will continue with Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Epicurus mainly. So maybe I will prioritize Marcus Aurelius as well, since you mentioned it. So once we are finished with what is ancient philosophy, perhaps we should read the Meditations together. All right. It was lovely to catch up with you all this morning before I get to work. A pleasure, as always. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for lending an ear. If you have any questions, of course, always feel free to drop them in the comments. The next chapter we're going to read together is called The Inception of the Idea of Doing Philosophy. Again, that notion of philosophy as a practice, as a way of life, rather than a system. And I will be back with you specifically about that notion of philosophy as a way of life, philosophy as a spiritual exercise. Thank you, guys. I'll see you later today.